Mara tied the apron strings twice. Not because they were loose, but because her hands needed something simple to do. The fabric was crisp and new, rented clean, smelling faintly of starch and the sharp lemon of industrial detergent. She could feel the restaurant's air conditioning pressing against her damp palms, turning the sweat at her knuckles cold. In the mirror behind the staff lockers, the uniform made her look like she belonged to a world that had never had to count coins at the bottom of a purse. White blouse without a wrinkle, black skirt that fell just below the knee, hair pinned back as if even stray strands were an offense. She watched herself practice a small smile, professional, neutral, careful. It was the kind of smile you wore to keep from being noticed too much. The restaurant itself sat on a corner where the city changed its mind about who it was. One street still carried the old neighborhood's tired storefronts and gray graffiti. The next was all glass and valet stands and men with watches that looked heavier than her monthly rent. Inside, everything was softened by money. Pale wood polished to a glow, tablecloths like smooth paper, candles that didn't flicker so much as breathe. The smell was layered: seared meat, butter, wine, and the delicate perfume of flowers that had never been left in a bucket overnight. Even sound seemed curated. There was a low hum of conversation, silverware touching plates like soft rain, and the faint music that made people feel important without drawing attention to itself. She arrived early as instructed and still felt late. The staff moved with a quick, practiced grace, bodies weaving between tables as if the layout lived inside their bones. A man at the service station glanced at her badge and didn't smile. "New girl," he said, not unkindly, but like he was naming a fact that would matter later. Another woman, older, with tired eyes and hair pulled tight, slid past her carrying a tray of glasses and gave her a look that was almost sympathy. In the kitchen doorway, heat spilled out in a wave, bringing the scent of garlic and sizzling oil. Then the door swung closed again and the dining room returned to its chilled composure. Orientation was brief, more choreography than welcome. The manager, a smooth man with a voice trained to sound calm, even when he wasn't, pointed out stations and rules with the speed of someone who assumed she already knew them. "We're about discretion," he said, tapping a laminated chart. "We're about anticipating needs. We don't hover, we don't interrupt. You'll learn our regulars." He lingered on that last word, regulars, as if the concept carried a private weight. When he mentioned the back alcove, an area shielded by a partial wall and heavy drapes, his eyes flicked up, checking who was listening. "That table," he said quieter, "is handled differently. You will not go there unless I tell you. Understood?" She nodded because she always nodded when men in suits spoke like that, but the instruction landed oddly. It wasn't framed like a standard VIP request. It felt like a warning that had been polished into policy. She followed his gesture to the alcove. From where she stood, she could only see the edge of a long table and the dim outline of a leather banquette. It looked like the kind of place where people wanted privacy for business or romance, but the drapes were heavier than necessary, and there was a faint sense of the room bending around it. As the first guests arrived, she took her section and tried to breathe in rhythm with the work. The motion soothed her. Pouring water without spilling, placing menus with the logo facing outward, speaking softly enough to feel intimate but not familiar. She noticed how customers here didn't raise their hands for service. They looked up and waited, expecting to be seen. She learned to watch for the slight shift of posture that meant someone wanted something, the tiny pause in conversation that opened a door for her to step in. It was a game of attention and invisibility at the same time, and she was good at it in a way that surprised her. Still, there was an undercurrent in the staff that didn't match the restaurant's calm. Every so often, someone would glance toward the alcove, then look away as if caught. When the phone rang at the host's stand and the host's face tightened for just a second, the whole room seemed to listen, even the kitchen. A busser stopped mid-step, holding a stack of plates, until the host hung up. No announcement followed, yet the mood shifted like a cloud passing over the sun. Mara misread it at first. She had worked diners and chain restaurants where the worst fear was a customer making a scene or stiffing a tip. Here, people were afraid in a different, quieter way, and she assumed it was class. She assumed they were intimidated by wealth, by the kind of patrons who wore tailored suits and spoke as if the air belonged to them. When she saw a waiter avoid eye contact with a man at the bar who snapped his fingers for attention, she rolled her eyes inwardly. Pride stirred in her chest, the stubborn kind that had carried her through rent hikes and humiliating interviews. She thought, I won't be like that. I'll do my job. I won't let rich people treat me like furniture. The woman with tired eyes, her name was Sonia, she learned, caught her near the beverage station and lowered her voice. Don't volunteer for everything, Sonia said, adjusting the napkins in her basket with hands that didn't stop moving. Just do your section. Keep your head down. Mara smiled politely. I'm not afraid of hard work. Sonia's gaze sharpened. It's not the work. Before Mara could ask, someone called Sonia's name, and she was gone, slipping into the dining room with her tray balanced perfectly, like a person trained to survive by never spilling anything. The first hint that it wasn't snobbery came not from a guest but from the way the manager moved. He checked his watch more than he checked the tables. He spoke to the host in murmurs that ended abruptly when anyone approached. When a man in a dark suit entered, no reservation, no greeting, he was ushered straight toward the alcove without question. The man's expression held no pleasure, no anticipation of a meal. He looked like he was there to measure the room. Mara felt a small chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She watched the staff react, shoulders tightening, voices lowering, steps quickening. A young waiter near her station swallowed hard and wiped his palms on his trousers, then forced a bright smile for a couple celebrating an anniversary. The contrast was unsettling, the way fear could be folded away like a napkin and placed beside a plate. She tried to anchor herself in practical tasks. She refilled water. She cleared plates. She noted special requests and delivered them without complaint. Yet her attention kept drifting back to the alcove, to the unseen gravity that pulled at everyone. The drapes stayed closed. The table remained empty, but the room behaved as if it were already occupied. Later, in the kitchen corridor, she heard two cooks speaking in quick, clipped phrases. She didn't catch much, only a name that sounded like it belonged in headlines, and the word tonight said with the kind of caution people used around storms. When Mara stepped closer, the conversation stopped. One of them stared at her apron as if it were evidence she shouldn't be there. By the time the dinner rush peaked, she understood that the restaurant was not simply a place where people ate. It was a stage where power sat down and expected to be served without being acknowledged. The staff weren't just employees. They were witnesses trained to forget what they saw. Discretion wasn't a luxury here. It was a form of protection. Mara carried a tray of champagne flutes to a table of laughing women and felt the fragile brightness of the glass tremble slightly with her pulse. She realized, with a quiet heaviness, that this job would ask her to do more than balance plates and remember orders. It would ask her to measure herself against other people's fear, to decide when to speak and when silence was the only way everyone made it home. When her shift ended, she untied her apron slowly, as if undoing it too fast might tear something she couldn't mend, and she walked out into the city night with the soft understanding that invisibility here was not humility. It was a rule written in the air. The second night Mara returned, the restaurant felt less like a promise and more like a test she hadn't studied for. The uniform was the same, white, black, crisp, a costume that pretended at simplicity, but the way it sat on her shoulders had changed. Last night she had worn it like armor. Tonight it felt like a sign, something that told everyone she was new before she even opened her mouth. The dining room had its usual controlled glow, candles set like small, steady breaths across linen, but beneath it ran a current of anticipation that didn't belong to the guests. It belonged to the staff, to the way they moved as if the floor might shift under their feet at any moment, and to the back alcove where the drapes still looked heavier than they needed to be. Mara arrived to find her station chart already marked, tidy handwriting assigning her tables close to the service station and far from the curtain-shadowed corner. It should have felt like good planning for a beginner, shorter distance, easier refills help nearby, but it landed wrong. She'd worked enough jobs to recognize the difference between support and containment. The head waiter gave instructions with a pleasant flatness, eyes skipping over her as if she were a chair that had been moved slightly out of place. Stay in your section, he said, and the words were common. But the tone carried something else, a carefulness that made her feel both small and singled out. The rush came early. A line formed at the host's stand, coats handed off, reservations confirmed with soft smiles. People arrived in groups that looked curated. Couples with quiet confidence, older men with younger companions, women in tailored jackets who spoke with the calm of people used to being heard. Plates began to move through the room like silent messages. Seafood arranged like art, sauces painted in deliberate swirls, glasses sweating cold. Mara found her rhythm quickly, because rhythm was what kept anxiety from showing. She refilled water before it was asked for, replaced silverware as if she were resetting a stage, kept her smile neutral so no guest could claim she was too warm or too distant. And still, she kept noticing the small redirections. A senior waiter would appear beside her when a tray was ready. Then, without explaining, take it from the counter and carry it elsewhere. A busser would reach for the ice bucket she'd set aside, then shake his head and walk it toward the back. Once, Mara stepped toward the alcove corridor with a basket of bread, only to have Sonia intercept her with the practiced ease of someone preventing an accident. "Not that way," Sonia murmured, taking the basket and angling her body so Mara had to pivot back toward her own tables. Sonia didn't look angry. She looked tired, like she'd spent years staying between other people and the things that could hurt them. At first Mara told herself it was training. They didn't want her getting overwhelmed, didn't want her making mistakes in the wrong place. But the longer the night went, the more the pattern sharpened, until it felt less like guidance and more like a quiet wall built out of other people's hands. She caught snippets as she passed the service station, fragments of conversation that stopped when she got too close, then resumed in softer tones behind her. Once she heard the words "fired on the spot," spoken with the grim certainty of someone reciting weather. Another time, she left crying, as if crying were not a private act but a known landmark in the restaurant's history. In the kitchen corridor, where heat rolled out in waves and the air tasted of salt and char, she paused to wait for a plate and listened without meaning to. Two waiters stood near the shelving, their backs turned, voices low and urgent. "He made the manager pay," one said, and the other gave a short, humorless laugh. "Out of pocket. Cash. Like it was nothing." The first voice added, "All because the wine wasn't the right year. Can you imagine?" There was a pause. Then the second voice muttered, "I can imagine. I saw it." The words hung in the air like the smell of burnt butter, heavy and lingering. Mara felt something in her chest tighten. Not fear exactly, but a quiet indignation that had always been easier for her to access than vulnerability. She thought of every job where a customer's bad mood became an employee's fault. Every manager who apologized to the wrong person because it was safer than defending the worker. This place had promised professionalism, the kind of environment where service was respected as skill. Yet it sounded already like the same old story wearing a silk tie. As the dining room filled, the back alcove remained closed off, but the staff's attention kept drifting there as if drawn by a magnet. The manager checked his watch, then the entrance, then the alcove again. The host spoke into the phone and nodded too quickly. A young waiter named Luis, she'd learned his name from the chart, moved like a person trying to keep his hands from shaking. He was assigned closer to the back, his section overlapping the corridor that led toward the drapes. Mara watched him wipe a glass twice even though it was already spotless, watched him force a smile that didn't reach his eyes. When Mara passed him near the drink station, she caught his expression and felt a surprising tug of empathy. He was not arrogant. He was not lazy. He looked like someone bracing for impact. She wanted to ask him what was happening, but she could sense the rule now. You didn't ask directly, not if you wanted to keep working here. Questions were treated like open flames. The moment that shifted her from suspicion to certainty was small, almost invisible. The manager stepped into the corridor, adjusted the drape as if checking it for dust, and murmured something to a man in a dark suit who had appeared without being seated. The man's face held no hospitality. It held assessment. He nodded once, and the manager's shoulders dropped as if relieved and ashamed at the same time. Mara watched from a distance, pretending to straighten a stack of menus, and realized the alcove wasn't merely a VIP table. It was a separate world inside the restaurant, governed by a different set of consequences. Her irritation returned, sharper now because it had a target. They were keeping her away not because she was incapable, but because they didn't want to risk her being seen. Newness was attention, and attention was dangerous. The thought made her cheeks warm, a flush that felt like humiliation. She hated being handled, hated being protected in a way that made her feel like an object rather than a person. It reminded her of other places where people had decided without asking what she could withstand. Near the peak of the rush, Louise faltered. It wasn't dramatic. It was the kind of slip that happens when exhaustion and pressure press down at once. A tray came up from the kitchen meant for the back section. 2 plates that looked expensive enough to cause a scene if they cooled. Louise reached for them, then froze, eyes flicking toward the corridor as if he'd forgotten how to walk. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. He set the tray down as if the heat might burn him. No one moved at first, not because they didn't see, but because everyone saw too much. Sonia's hands stilled on the coffee cups. The head waiter's jaw tightened. The manager turned his head but didn't step in, as if even being near that table carried a risk. Mara felt the room tilt in her perception. She could see the logic of their avoidance, could almost understand the fear that made grown adults behave like children around a closed curtain. But she also felt the other truth, the one that had kept her afloat in harder jobs. If you let people treat you like less, they rarely stop on their own. She thought of Louise's trembling hands, of Sonia's tired warnings, of managers paying out of pocket for someone else's cruelty. It wasn't only fear, it was a system, and the system fed on compliance. Her pride rose, not loud, but steady. She stepped forward before she could talk herself out of it. "I can take that," she said, voice calm enough to sound like routine. A few heads turned. Sonia's eyes widened slightly, a silent plea. The head waiter started to shake his head, but the movement was small, hesitant, as if he didn't want to be the one to say no out loud. Mara reached for the tray anyway, fingers steady under the weight. The plates were warm through the metal, heat pressing into her palms. She didn't feel brave. She felt stubborn, and stubbornness had always been her way of refusing to feel helpless. She met Louise's gaze for a second, and in his eyes she saw gratitude mixed with alarm, as if she'd offered to step into traffic. Walking toward the corridor, she noticed how the dining room sounds seemed to soften behind her. It wasn't silence. It was the way attention gathers without announcing itself. She could feel co-workers watching, could sense the manager's tension like a wire pulled too tight. Mara kept her posture straight, chin level, as if carrying plates into a private section were the most ordinary task in the world. She told herself that if she acted like it was normal, it would become normal, at least for the length of her steps. When she reached the edge of the drape, she paused just long enough to breathe and steady the tray against her hip. Whatever waited beyond it had already shaped the room without showing its face. Mara understood that now. She also understood that she'd made a choice, one rooted in pride, yes, but also in something like fairness, the simple refusal to let fear dictate every movement. For a moment, she let herself feel the weight of that decision and accept it fully, without dramatizing it. Then she lifted her hand toward the curtain with the quiet determination of someone trying to belong in a place that asked her, from the start, to disappear. Mara's fingers were still warm from the plates when she touched the edge of the curtain. The fabric was heavier up close, lined like a winter coat, muffling the dining room behind her until the laughter and clinking glass became a distant, polite blur. For a brief second she stood there with the tray balanced against her hip, feeling the strange weight of being watched without seeing anyone's eyes. In her mind she held on to the simple logic that had carried her through other jobs. Food goes hot to the table, guests receive it, you keep moving. She told herself that whatever stories lived around this section, the work itself was ordinary. That belief was less naive than it was necessary, a small internal steadiness she needed in order to move her feet. Inside the alcove, the air felt slightly warmer, scented with a darker cologne and the faint bitterness of espresso. The lighting was lower, the candle flames tucked into thicker glass, and the leather of the banquette shone softly like something expensive that had been cared for with deliberate hands. There were men seated around the long table, not crowded but positioned with space that read as control. Their suits were dark and perfectly fitted, their posture relaxed in a way that didn't invite closeness. On the near side sat the man Mara understood, without being told, was the boss. He wasn't the oldest, but he occupied the room as if age were irrelevant. His hair was neatly combed, his face clean-shaven, his expression set in a calm that seemed almost bored. The calm didn't feel peaceful. It felt practiced, like a door you couldn't push open. No one looked surprised to see her, and that was its own kind of warning. A couple of the men glanced at the tray, then back to Mara's face, their eyes moving with slow appraisal, as if they were taking inventory. The boss kept his gaze on his plate, a white porcelain surface as immaculate as a promise. He lifted his glass, took a measured sip, and set it down without a sound. The absence of sound in that motion felt intentional, like the room was full of small demonstrations that didn't need words. Mara stepped forward and placed the plates down with the same careful precision she'd used at every other table. She could feel her pulse in her wrists, but her hands remained steady. Professionalism, she reminded herself, was a kind of dignity. She offered the brief, practiced description of the dish, her tone neutral, her eyes trained to meet faces without lingering. She expected a nod, perhaps a dismissive grunt. Instead, one of the men on the far end reached lazily for the bread basket as if bored by the ceremony, then flicked his fingers toward Mara in a gesture that wasn't exactly a snap but carried the same meaning. It was the kind of motion used for dogs, for objects, for things that moved on command. The gesture was small, almost nothing, and in most places it might have been swallowed by the night's noise and forgotten. Here, in this curtained pocket of the restaurant, it landed with a sharp clarity. Mara felt her stomach tighten with an old, familiar heat. She'd seen that gesture before in different forms. A customer waving without looking, a man whistling at a cashier, a hand raised as if the air itself should part. She had tolerated it in the past when she needed the paycheck and didn't have the energy to argue. But something about this room, about the way everyone else had built their lives around avoiding it, made that small disrespect feel like a line drawn in front of her. She didn't correct him with anger. Anger would have been too easy for them to dismiss as attitude. Instead, she let the tray rest more firmly against her hip, lifted her chin slightly, and said in a calm voice that carried just enough volume to be heard, "If you need something, you can ask me directly. I'm right here." She kept her expression polite, almost gentle, as if she were explaining a rule of the house rather than challenging a man's pride. The words were simple, clean, the kind of correction a teacher might offer a child without humiliating them. The man's mouth twitched, half amusement, half irritation. His eyes slid toward the boss, as if checking what was permitted. That alone told Mara she'd stepped into a hierarchy she didn't fully understand. Across the table, another man let out a low breath that might have been a laugh, but it didn't reach warmth. The boss finally looked up. His gaze met Mara's with an unhurried stillness. Up close, his eyes were darker than she'd expected. Not in color alone, but in the way they held attention without giving any away. He did not look angry. He looked curious in the way predators are curious, not because they are impressed, but because they are deciding. The room seemed to tighten around that gaze. Mara sensed, without turning, the subtle shift of bodies behind her, as if men who had been relaxed were now more awake. "You're new," the boss said, his voice low and even, the words delivered like an observation rather than an introduction. There was no greeting, no acknowledgement of her as a person beyond her novelty. The contempt wasn't loud. It was controlled, like ice laid neatly over a surface. "Yes," Mara replied, and forced herself to keep the same professional tone she used for any guest. "And we're happy to have you here this evening." A quiet pause followed, long enough to feel like a hand resting on the back of her neck. The boss's mouth curved slightly, not into a smile but into something that resembled one from a distance. "Happy?" he repeated, as if tasting the word and finding it decorative. Then his eyes flicked, briefly, toward the man who had made the gesture, and the man's expression changed at once. Subtle, but real, the way a dog's posture shifts when it hears its owner's step. The boss did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He simply said, "Don't teach my people manners." The sentence was calm, almost mild, but it carried the weight of a boundary laid down in stone. It wasn't only about the gesture. It was about authority, about who was allowed to correct whom in this space. Mara felt the coldness of it settle into her chest. Not fear exactly, but the dawning recognition that she had spoken a language they did not accept from her. "I'm not teaching," she said, still polite, still steady, though her throat felt tighter. "I'm doing my job. Respect makes service easier for everyone." She heard her own words and knew, even as she said them, that they sounded reasonable in a world built on reason. In this alcove, reason wasn't the currency. Control was. The boss stared at her for another long beat, and Mara felt the silence become something physical. She could sense the men around him waiting, not for an explosion, but for a signal. The absence of rage was worse than rage. Rage could burn out quickly. This was colder, patient, the kind of reaction that didn't need drama because it assumed it would be obeyed eventually. Finally, he leaned back slightly, as if the exchange had ended in his mind. "Bring the wine," he said, not to Mara specifically, but to the air, to the concept of service itself. It was dismissal disguised as instruction. Mara nodded once because refusing would have been a different kind of fight, and she was still trying to stay inside the boundaries of her job. She turned carefully, keeping the tray balanced, and stepped back through the curtain. The dining room's brighter light hit her face like a change in weather. The noise returned in layers, the warm clatter of a restaurant pretending nothing unusual had occurred. But the staff near the corridor looked as if they'd witnessed something that would be paid for later. Sonia stood by the coffee station, her eyes wide, her mouth pressed tight. Luis hovered near the service counter with a tray in his hands, and his gaze flicked from Mara to the curtain like he was watching a door that might open on its own. The head waiter approached her with controlled urgency. He didn't touch her, but he stood too close, invading the space the uniform was supposed to protect. "What did you say to him?" he asked, voice low, strained. "I asked for basic respect," Mara replied, still breathing carefully, still holding on to the idea that clarity would make them understand. His face tightened as if she'd said something obscene. "You embarrassed him," he whispered, and the words were not accusation so much as fear speaking through him. "Do you understand what you did?" Mara felt heat rise in her cheeks again, the same humiliation as before but sharpened by their reaction. "I didn't embarrass anyone," she said, quieter now. "It was a small correction. He's a customer." Sonia's voice cut in, soft but intense. "He's not a customer," she said, and then she stopped herself, eyes darting around as if the walls might repeat her words. "Just don't." Mara looked at them, at their pale faces, their rigid shoulders, their eyes that couldn't settle, and something inside her hardened into a different shape. She saw what they saw. Not a rude man, but a force that could reach into their lives and rearrange them. She also saw something else, something that made her angry in a quieter way. They had accepted this arrangement so completely that they mistook her refusal for recklessness, as if dignity were the same as danger. But she could not bring herself to apologize for insisting on being spoken to like a human being. She could only stand there, apron tied tight, hands smelling faintly of metal and food, and feel the widening gap between her and the people who worked beside her. In that gap lived misunderstanding, fear, and a stubborn pride that did not yet know how costly it could become. When she returned to her section, she moved with the same careful grace as before, but inside she carried a new, quiet awareness. In this restaurant, respect was not a shared expectation. It was a privilege granted downward, and she had reached for it as if it belonged to everyone. The next shift began with the same polished calm that had fooled Mara on her first night, but now she could read the strain beneath it. The dining room's light still made the tablecloths look untouched by human hands, and the scent of citrus polish still floated over the darker smells of wine and roasted meat. Yet the staff carried themselves like people walking around a sleeping animal. Mara felt it in the way Sonia avoided meeting her eyes for too long, as if sympathy might be mistaken for alliance, and in the way Louis spoke to her only in short, practical phrases, his voice careful as he stacked glassware. No one scolded her outright for what happened in the alcove, but the absence of scolding felt like its own message. In places like this, punishment didn't always come as noise. Sometimes it came as silence that trained you to shrink. Mara tried to do what she always did when discomfort threatened to leak into her work. She moved faster, cleaner, more precise. She folded napkins with sharp corners, aligned cutlery with obsessive neatness, checked her section twice before any guest could flag her down. Professionalism had always been her refuge, the one thing she could control when people's moods were unpredictable. But the more perfect she tried to be, the more she felt the restaurant's real expectation pressing on her. Something quieter than service. It was an expectation that she would learn how to stand in the right places, say the right amount, and accept the wrong things without showing it on her face. An hour into the shift, when the dining room was still filling and the first wave of reservations had just been seated, the manager appeared beside her station with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He did not raise his voice, did not gesture sharply, did not make a scene. He simply leaned slightly closer, as if sharing a friendly note. "Mara," he said, smooth and controlled, "can we talk for a moment?" The request sounded polite, but it wasn't framed like a question. It was a decision. His hand hovered near her elbow without touching, guiding her toward the corridor behind the service station, where the hum of the dining room softened into a muffled background. Back there, the restaurant smelled less like candle wax and more like work. Soap, damp linen, the sharp bite of bleach. A stack of crates sat against the wall, and a metal shelf rattled faintly each time someone pushed through the swinging door to the kitchen. It was not a place for guests to see. It was a place where the restaurant admitted, privately, that it ran on tired bodies and hidden mess. The manager chose that spot deliberately. It made the conversation feel like something to be kept behind the scenes, like a stain you didn't want on the front room's whiteness. He didn't reprimand her, not directly. He didn't praise her, either. He spoke as if he were explaining a simple workplace reality she had failed to grasp. "I understand you come from other places," he said, the words wrapped in a tone meant to sound understanding. "And I respect that you want to do things the right way. But here, the right way is different." He paused, watching her face closely, as if measuring whether she would resist. "Some of our patrons are sensitive. They spend a lot of money. They expect certain things. What they don't expect is to be corrected." Mara's jaw tightened, though she kept her expression neutral. The manager continued, careful to sound reasonable. "No one is asking you to be mistreated," he said, and the line felt rehearsed, like something written by people who had never actually been mistreated. "But we need you to learn how things work. There are dynamics. There are relationships. If you provoke someone important, it doesn't just affect you. It affects all of us." The words lodged under Mara's ribs, heavy and familiar. She had heard versions of them before. "Don't rock the boat, don't make it personal, just smile, just take it." The difference here was the restaurant's elegance. The way exploitation arrived in a tailored suit and spoke gently. She wanted to say that respect wasn't a provocation, that basic decency shouldn't be a special request. But she could already hear how those words would be received, not as principle, but as inconvenience. The manager lowered his voice further, as if intimacy could turn pressure into mentorship. "I'm going to be clear," he said. "If that table feels disrespected, we lose business. We lose safety. We lose stability. We can't have that. So, you will not go near that section unless you're instructed, and you will not correct anyone at that table again. Do you understand?" Mara's pulse thudded behind her ears. She understood what he was asking, and what he was refusing to name. He was asking for compliance dressed as professionalism. He was asking her to swallow her dignity so the restaurant could keep its arrangement intact. And he was doing it with the calm authority of someone who believed the arrangement was inevitable. "I understand what you're saying," she replied, choosing her words with care. "But I didn't insult anyone. I spoke politely." The manager's smile thinned. "Polite doesn't matter," he said, and for the first time his tone edged toward impatience. "Perception matters. Status matters. You're new. You don't know the history. Trust me, you don't want to be the one who tests it. He let the statement sit there, then softened again, as if to show he could switch between steel and velvet whenever he wished. I'm not threatening you, he added, almost kindly. I'm protecting your job. Mara nodded because she needed to return to the floor, and because arguing in a hallway that smelled of bleach wouldn't change the power structure of the dining room. But as she walked back toward her station, she felt the bitter aftertaste of the conversation settle in her mouth. The manager had not said the boss's name. He had not described any explicit consequence. He hadn't needed to. The restaurant itself had become the consequence, shaping everyone's behavior in advance. I understand what you're saying, she replied, choosing her words with care. But I didn't insult anyone. I spoke politely. The manager's smile thinned. Polite doesn't matter, he said, and for the first time his tone edged toward impatience. Perception matters. Status matters. You're new. You don't know the history. Trust me, you don't want to be the one who tests it. He let the statement sit there, then softened again, as if to show he could switch between steel and velvet whenever he wished. I'm not threatening you, he added, almost kindly. I'm protecting your job. Mara nodded because she needed to return to the floor, and because arguing in a hallway that smelled of bleach wouldn't change the power structure of the dining room. But as she walked back toward her station, she felt the bitter aftertaste of the conversation settle in her mouth. The manager had not said the boss's name. He had not described any explicit consequence. He hadn't needed to. The restaurant itself had become the consequence, shaping everyone's behavior in advance. Later, near the end of the rush, when Mara was refilling water for a couple who barely looked up from their wine list, a coworker she hardly knew brushed past her at the service station. His name tag read Aaron, though she had only seen him twice, always moving quickly, always staying in the shadows of the dining room. He didn't make eye contact at first. He pretended to be reaching for a stack of clean plates. Then, in a voice so low it almost dissolved into the background noise, he said, "You should stop pushing." Mara turned slightly, pretending to adjust her tray, and waited. Aaron's face remained angled toward the plates, but his eyes flicked to her for an instant, an anxious, warning glance. "It's not just about tips," he murmured. "It's debt. The restaurant owes people. Money came from places it shouldn't have. You think the manager is scared because of manners? He's scared because he can't afford to offend them. None of us can." The words landed with a dull certainty, not dramatic, not exaggerated. Just the practical kind of truth that explained too much at once. Mara's first instinct was to reject it, to tell herself it was gossip, paranoia, staffroom mythology. But she remembered the fragments she'd overheard. A manager paying cash out of pocket, firings without paperwork, the way the host tightened when the phone rang, the way even the cooks lowered their voices when certain names entered the air. It all aligned into something that felt less like rumor and more like structure. Aaron swallowed, his throat bobbing. "People here have families," he added, still not looking at her fully. "People have papers they're waiting on, rent they're behind on. You think you're only fighting for yourself, but it spreads." He paused, then made himself a little colder, as if kindness would make him vulnerable. "Just be smart." Mara stood still for a moment with her hands on the edge of the counter, feeling the stainless steel's chill seep into her fingertips. In her mind, two versions of reality pressed against each other. In one, she kept her head down, did what she was told, and kept a job that paid better than most. She became invisible like the others, learned to swallow her pride in small, daily doses until it stopped tasting like anything. In the other, she insisted on dignity, not as a performance but as a boundary, and risked becoming the reason someone else lost shifts, lost money, lost stability. The moral dilemma sharpened into something painfully adult. Sometimes doing the right thing didn't only cost you. When she returned to her tables, she watched her guests through a new lens. A man in a tailored suit snapped his fingers once, not cruelly, just absent-mindedly, and Mara felt the impulse to correct him rise and then stall behind her teeth. She saw, suddenly, how easy it was to slip into compromise not because you agreed, but because you were tired. She carried plates with steady hands and kept her voice soft, but inside she was measuring the invisible chains Aaron had named. The restaurant's elegance was still there, the candles still glowing, the wine still poured in perfect arcs, yet Mara could feel the hidden ledger beneath it all. By the time her shift ended, she did not feel defeated. She felt awake. She folded her apron slowly, smoothing the fabric as if she could smooth the situation itself, and she accepted one clear truth. The question in front of her wasn't whether she could endure disrespect. She already knew she could. The question was whether she was willing to become part of a system that demanded silence as the price of survival, and whether her insistence on dignity could exist without becoming another burden placed on people who already carried too much. The night he returned, Mara felt it before she saw him. It wasn't superstition so much as pattern recognition, the way a body learns to read a room the way it reads weather. The host stand stiffened in that almost imperceptible way, smiles becoming tighter, words becoming fewer. The dining room's warm hush, wine being poured, chairs sliding softly. Laughter kept at a socially acceptable volume. Didn't stop, but it thinned, as if everyone had taken a small step back inside themselves. Even the music sounded more careful, as if it had been trained not to reach too far. Mara was polishing cutlery at the service station when Sonia walked past with a tray and did not look at her. But Mara caught the tension in her shoulders, the way you could tell a person was holding their breath without admitting it. Mara told herself she would not build her shift around one table, not even that one. She had already paid for the lesson of being singled out. Management had wrapped their warning in soft language, the same velvet that always hid a hand on your throat. A coworker had named the word debt, and it had changed the air in Mara's mind. Debt meant obligation, and obligation meant that dignity was negotiable. The thought still tasted bitter, but it also made her more alert to what she could actually control. Her tone, her posture, her boundaries, the small daily choices that could be made without a grand speech. He arrived without fanfare, which was its own kind of fanfare. A man in a dark suit entered first, scanned the room, and nodded once toward the host as if confirming a prearranged shape of reality. Then the boss appeared, not rushing, not smiling, not looking around to be admired. He walked as if the floor belonged to him, not because he stomped, but because he didn't adapt his body to other people's presence. The host moved at once, leading him toward the alcove with the drapes, and the manager materialized with a face that tried to look like hospitality and failed. Mara watched from the edge of her section, hands full of water glasses, and felt her stomach tighten into a disciplined knot. She expected the usual redirections to begin immediately. Someone stepping in front of her, a whispered instruction, a station chart rewritten on the fly. Instead, the manager approached her directly. His expression was composed, but his eyes were too bright, like a man rehearsing calm while his mind ran calculations. "Mara," he said, voice low, "he asked for you." The words landed in her body like a weight set gently on her chest. "Asked for you." In another context, it could have been flattering, a guest requesting a server they liked. Here it felt like being summoned. She heard the difference between preference and possession, and she could see the same difference in the way Sonia's face changed across the room, her mouth tightening as if she were swallowing something sharp. "I'm assigned to my section," Mara said carefully. She kept her voice neutral, not defiant, not fearful. "You told me not to go near that table." The manager's eyes flicked toward the alcove as if the curtain itself could hear. "I know what I told you," he replied, the patience in his tone strained. "This is different. He's requesting you specifically. Just do what you need to do, and keep it professional. Keep it professional." The phrase again, the restaurant's favorite instrument. Professional meant whatever protected the restaurant's interests, even if it stripped the staff down to obedient gestures. Mara's hands were cold now, the glass sweating against her skin. She looked around and saw how her coworkers avoided meeting her eyes, not because they disliked her, but because they didn't want to share the spotlight of his attention. In their silence, she felt the shape of their fear, and she felt the shape of something else too. Relief that it wasn't them tonight. Mara wiped her palms on her apron, squared her shoulders, and walked toward the drapes with the practiced composure of someone who refused to hurry for another person's power. She told herself that if he wanted her service, she would give him service, not herself. The distinction was small but necessary. She stepped through the heavy curtain and felt the temperature shift again, warmer, closer, scented with expensive cologne and coffee and something metallic that might have been her own adrenaline. The boss sat where he had sat before, posture relaxed, suit immaculate, hands resting lightly on the table as if he were waiting for something inevitable. Around him, the entourage held their places with a stillness that was not casual. Mara noticed it more clearly now. Their eyes moved constantly, but not randomly. They tracked him. They watched his hands, the angle of his head, the timing of his blinks, as if he were the only clock that mattered. When she entered, two of them glanced at her and then quickly looked away, not dismissive, but cautious, as if her presence was data they didn't yet know how to interpret. He looked up and met her gaze without warmth. "You," he said, not as an insult, not as a greeting, just identification, as if confirming the object that had arrived. Then, with the same calm contempt he wore like a tailored jacket, he added, "I like consistency." Mara felt the urge to react, to point out that people were not table settings, not interchangeable pieces of consistency. But she kept her expression smooth. "Good evening," she said. "What can I get for you tonight?" For a moment, the boss studied her face, and Mara had the uncomfortable sensation of being examined for cracks. His eyes moved briefly to her name tag, then back up, an attention to detail so casual it felt automatic. "Mara," he said, pronouncing it correctly, as if he'd practiced once. It wasn't intimacy. It was possession of information. "Yes," she replied. "Would you like the wine list?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced toward one of his men. A subtle movement, barely a tilt. The man responded at once, shifting a glass slightly, straightening a napkin. Mara understood then what she had only sensed before. The boss's cruelty wasn't only personal temperament. It was an atmosphere he controlled, a performance that kept everyone else orbiting him in predictable ways. The entourage's obedience made his stillness look more powerful. Their readiness made his calm look absolute. "I'll have the same as last time," the boss said finally. Mara nodded. "Of course. I'll confirm the bottle with the bar to make sure we bring the correct vintage." One of the men at the table let out a short, humorless breath, the closest thing to a laugh, as if her attention to detail amused him. The boss's gaze sharpened slightly, and the man's expression flattened at once. The correction didn't need words. It traveled through the air as a lesson everyone had already learned. "You're careful," the boss said, tone unreadable. "It's my job," Mara answered. She kept her voice steady and unembellished. "And it prevents mistakes." The word mistakes seemed to echo in the space between them. Mara thought of the story she'd overheard, someone paying out of pocket for a wrong year, for a perceived slight. She felt the moral pressure of that memory, the way it tried to push her into submission before anything even happened. She inhaled slowly, letting the breath steady her spine. She would not apologize in advance for existing. As she turned to leave, the boss spoke again, and the way he said it made the request sound like a favor he was granting. "You will serve this table tonight," he said. "I don't want anyone else." Mara paused. The sentence could have been framed as preference, but it carried ownership in its bones. She faced him again, careful not to let her fear show as anger, careful not to let her pride become a spectacle. "I'll take care of your table when I'm assigned to it and when it doesn't compromise service for my other guests," she said. "If I'm needed elsewhere, another server may assist briefly." The entourage's attention tightened, a subtle collective inhale. It was not the kind of room where staff spoke in complete sentences to him, especially not sentences that contained conditions. Mara felt the risk of her words, but she also felt something steadier underneath. If she allowed herself to be treated as a thing, she would become one, and it would not stop here. Boundaries had to be stated in the language available to her, professional, calm, reasonable, even if the room did not believe she had the right to them. The boss did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. That restraint, in a way, was more unnerving because it suggested choice. He could have reacted loudly, could have made an example, and he didn't. He simply watched her for a long moment, his expression almost bored, as if her resistance were an expected line in a familiar play. Then his mouth curved slightly, not into a smile, but into the suggestion of one. "We'll see," he said softly, and the words were not a cliff, not a promise of violence, but a statement of intent. He would observe, he would test, he would measure. Mara nodded once, not in surrender but in acknowledgement that the exchange had ended. She stepped back through the curtain and felt the dining room's brighter light hit her face like relief that didn't fully soothe. At the service station, Sonia looked at her finally, eyes tired and tense. Mara didn't offer a triumphant expression, because there was nothing to be triumphant about. She simply began arranging the order with meticulous care, double-checking details, refusing to give anyone an easy excuse to punish someone else for her presence. As the night continued, Mara found herself watching the alcove from the corner of her eye while pretending not to. She noticed that the boss's men reacted to him more than he reacted to anything. She noticed that his cruelty arrived in quiet choices, who he acknowledged, who he ignored, what he demanded without raising a hand. And she noticed, most of all, that he seemed to be studying her not for service quality, but for something more personal, whether she could be bent into the shape he preferred. Mara carried plates, poured wine, and maintained her composure, letting her steadiness become the only answer she could safely give. By the time the rush eased and the room's energy softened, she felt a strange, sober clarity settle in her chest. He had tried to claim her attention as if it were his. She had not allowed it, and the world had not ended. The night closed without spectacle, but with a new understanding written quietly into Mara's muscles. Control could be challenged without shouting, and sometimes the most dangerous negotiation was the one conducted in calm voices and polite phrases. Sonia's life came into focus for Mara in fragments, the way you learn someone's story in a workplace where nobody has time to sit and explain themselves. It was in the way Sonia counted her change at the end of the night with quick, practiced fingers, lips moving silently as if she didn't trust the numbers to stay put unless she held them in her mouth. It was in the way she tucked extra bread into a small paper bag during closing, not stealing, just saving what would be thrown away, the kind of habit that came from years of stretching meals. Sonia's uniform was always spotless, but her eyes carried a tiredness that no amount of makeup could hide. When she smiled at guests, it was genuine in its politeness, but it vanished the moment she turned away, replaced by a look of someone who was always listening for the next problem. That night, the dining room filled with the usual flow of money and expectation, and Mara tried to focus on her own tables. Yet the restaurant had a way of pulling attention toward its quiet center of gravity. The alcove drapes remained mostly closed, but the presence behind them shaped everything around it. Mara had served the boss again, as instructed, and had maintained her calm boundaries without raising her voice. She had made it through the exchange with her spine intact, but the cost of that steadiness showed in the room around her. Co-workers moved as if her composure were a gamble they hadn't agreed to take. In the short breaks between orders, Mara began noticing the small private economies that kept the staff afloat. Tips were not just extra money here. They were the difference between stability and disaster. Sonia, whose hands never stopped moving, kept a tiny notebook in her apron pocket. Mara saw her write numbers down quickly when she thought no one was watching, then tear out a page and fold it small enough to disappear into her fist. Once, when Sonia's phone buzzed in her locker, she checked the screen and her face tightened so sharply it looked like pain. She shoved the phone away and returned to the floor with the same polite smile, as if whatever message she'd received did not have the power to unmake her. Later, in the service corridor, Sonia leaned against the wall for half a minute while the kitchen plated a complicated order. Her shoulders sagged in a way that made Mara realize how much effort it took for Sonia to keep them straight in the dining room. Mara stood beside her, holding a tray, and felt the awkwardness of proximity. They weren't friends. They were co-workers who had shared air and anxiety, which sometimes looked like friendship from a distance. Sonia spoke first, quietly, without looking directly at Mara. "You did okay," she said, and the words sounded like a concession. Mara kept her eyes on the kitchen doorway. I didn't want to make things harder. Sonia let out a small breath that was almost a laugh, except it held no humor. Harder is what it is, she murmured. Some nights are just like that. Mara wanted to ask about the notebook, the tense phone check, the way Sonia guarded herself like a person carrying something breakable. But she didn't ask. Questions had a way of spreading. Still, Sonia's silence didn't feel like secrecy for its own sake. Felt like triage. A few minutes later, when they were both back on the floor, Mara watched Sonia glide between tables, collecting empty plates with the grace of someone who had learned to disappear without looking small. At one table, an older man flirted with her in a tone that assumed entitlement, and Sonia smiled politely, laughed soft and brief, then moved on. Mara could see the calculation in it. The smile was a tool, not surrender. It bought peace, and peace paid rent. The young busser, Matteo, was the opposite kind of survival story. He moved quickly and loudly, as if speed could make him important. He was barely out of his teens, with hair cut sharp and a posture that tried to mimic confidence. When he carried stacks of plates, he held them like trophies. He lingered near the alcove more than anyone else did, not entering, not crossing the invisible boundary, but hovering close enough to feel included by proximity. Mara had noticed him watching the suited men the way other kids watched athletes. Admiration mixed with hunger. At one point, Matteo rushed past Mara and nearly bumped her tray. She steadied it without spilling, and he flashed her a grin that was too bright. Sorry, he said, but his eyes had already darted toward the drapes again. They're in there tonight, right? Mara kept her expression neutral. Just watch where you're going. Matteo's grin faltered. You don't get it, he said, lowering his voice as if sharing something exciting. Those guys, they don't wait for permission. People move when they walk in. That's real power. Mara stared at him for a beat, surprised by how openly he said it, as if power were a toy he wanted to hold. Real power shouldn't need fear, she replied quietly. Matteo shrugged, the gesture careless, almost disrespectful in its ease. Fear works, he said, and then he hurried off, drawn back into his errands like a moth to light. Mara watched him go and felt something shift in her understanding. Matteo didn't fear the boss. Matteo romanticized him. He saw control and mistook it for freedom. He was too young to know that power built on intimidation was a cage for everyone in the room, including the man holding the key. The head waiter, Victor, was harder to read. He was always aligned with management in public, delivering instructions with crisp authority, correcting staff with a tone that suggested loyalty to standards. Yet Mara noticed the cracks. Victor's tie was always straight, but his eyes looked tired in a way that didn't match his age. His hands sometimes trembled slightly when he set down a tray, then steadied again as if he hated being caught human. When he walked past the alcove, his steps slowed by a fraction, and his gaze flicked to the drapes with a look that wasn't awe or admiration. It was resignation. During a lull, Mara found herself at the service station beside Victor while he checked the reservation list. The paper rustled under his fingers. His face remained neutral, but his jaw worked subtly, as if he were grinding down words he didn't want to speak. Mara took a risk that wasn't dramatic, just human. You've been here a long time, she said. Victor didn't look up immediately. Long enough, he answered. Mara hesitated, then added, Does it ever get easier? The way things work. Victor finally lifted his eyes to her, and there was something in that look that made Mara feel as if she'd stepped into a private room. Not anger, not threat, just exhaustion so deep it had become a kind of personality. Easier, he repeated softly, then shook his head once. You get used to it. That's not the same thing. Mara felt her throat tighten. Why stay? Victor's gaze flicked toward the dining room, toward the guests laughing under candlelight, toward the staff moving like shadows. His voice lowered. Because leaving costs money, he said. Because starting over costs time. Because some of us have paperwork tied to employment, and some of us have families tied to our hours, and some of us have mistakes behind us. He paused, then added, almost harshly, Because sometimes the only thing you can do is keep your head down and make sure your people get paid. The phrase "your people" struck Mara. Victor didn't sound like a coward. He sounded like a man who had made compromises he hated because other people depended on him. Mara thought of Sonia counting tips, of the paper bag of bread, of the tightness in her face when her phone buzzed. She thought of custody schedules and school fees, of rent notices, of a child waiting at home for a mother who couldn't afford to lose a shift. She thought of Aaron's warning about debt, and how debt wasn't just money but leverage, the kind that wrapped itself around a whole staff and pulled. Mara's defiance, which had felt clean in her mind, a simple insistence on respect, began to look more complicated under this light. It wasn't that dignity didn't matter. It was that dignity had a price here, and the price wasn't always paid by the person who spoke up. Fear wasn't only the fear of violence. It was the fear of losing the fragile systems people had built to keep their lives from collapsing. When Mara returned to her tables, she served a couple celebrating an anniversary, watching them hold hands over white linen as if the world were gentle. She poured wine and heard Sonia laugh softly at a nearby table, the sound practiced and careful. She watched Mateo dart past with plates, eyes shining with admiration for the wrong kind of strength. She saw Victor correct a server with crisp professionalism, then turn away and rub his forehead briefly, a motion so small it might have been nothing. By closing, Mara felt less certain of the simple story she had been telling herself. She wasn't the brave new girl rescuing everyone from fear. She was one person inside a structure that fed on other people's need to survive. That realization didn't make her surrender. It made her more careful. When she untied her apron at the end of the night, she did it slowly, feeling the knot loosen like a small release. She understood now that courage without context could become selfishness, and that respect, in a place like this, was not one-in-one confrontation. It was negotiated in the quiet spaces where people counted tips, checked phones with tight faces, and chose silence not because they loved it, but because they needed tomorrow to arrive. The incident began the way most workplace disasters do. Small enough to dismiss, ordinary enough to mistake for routine. The restaurant was in that late evening stretch when the rush softened but never truly ended. When the tables were still full and the staff moved with the weariness of people who had been polite for hours. Candlelight made everything look calmer than it felt. The air carried a mixed scent of steak fat and citrus peel, espresso and chilled wine, and under it all the faint bleach note from the back corridor that clung to uniforms no matter how carefully they were washed. Mara had just cleared a Four Tops dessert plates when she noticed Victor standing at the service station with a check presenter open in his hand, staring down as if the paper had insulted him. He didn't raise his voice, but the atmosphere tightened anyway. Victor had a way of pulling quiet into a space when he wanted it, the sort of authority that didn't need theatrics because everyone understood the cost of ignoring it. He slid the presenter across the counter to the manager, who had appeared as if summoned by tension alone. Mara caught a glimpse of the inside. A receipt, a line that should have been filled, a blank that looked too clean. The manager's face didn't change much. He trained it not to, but his eyes sharpened, and Mara felt the temperature in her body shift as if she'd walked too close to an open freezer. "What's missing?" the manager asked, voice low. Victor's expression remained controlled, though the skin around his eyes tightened. "Payment," he said simply. "And one of the bottles from the lock." The word lock hit Mara differently than payment. Payment could be delayed, mistaken, processed under the wrong table. A bottle from the lock suggested a different category of problem, one that didn't belong to ordinary customer service. Mara watched the manager's gaze flick, quick and involuntary, toward the draped alcove. Even from across the room, she could feel the invisible line connecting the missing item to that table. The restaurant's fear had a direction, and it always pointed there. Sonia was nearby, stacking polished cutlery, and her hands froze for half a second. Mateo, carrying a tub of dishes, slowed as if his body had decided to listen before his mind could pretend not to. The staff's attention gathered without anyone speaking, each person pretending to be busy while their eyes tracked the same axis. Mara felt the old instinct to step back, to let the people with seniority handle it, but she was already part of it by proximity. The manager's gaze landed on her like a fingertip pressing lightly into a bruise. Mara's stomach tightened. She hadn't touched any locked bottle. She hadn't handled the alcove check beyond delivering service under direct instruction. Yet she could already sense the narrative forming, the easiest story to tell when a workplace needed someone to absorb blame. The new girl, the one who challenged the unwritten rules, the one who drew attention. Responsibility in places like this didn't always follow facts. It followed convenience. The manager motioned Victor closer, their heads leaning together for a few murmured seconds. Mara couldn't hear the words, but she saw Victor's jaw clench, the subtle flare of his nostrils. Then the manager straightened and walked toward the corridor near the alcove with a deliberate pace that looked calm only because panic would have been too revealing. Two men in dark suits, part of the boss's entourage, were already positioned near the drapes, not blocking the way, but making it clear who controlled access. Their faces held the same unreadable patience as before, as if they had all night to wait for answers. Mara tried to continue working, but her hands felt clumsy. She poured water for a table that barely noticed her, and the sound of the stream seemed too loud in her ears. She cleared empty glasses and felt the tremor in her wrist. She could see Sonia moving faster, her shoulders tight, as if speed might protect her. She could see Matteo watching with a strange brightness in his eyes, excitement mixed with fear, the way some people watch danger as if it were entertainment until it reached them personally. A few minutes later, the manager returned, and the dining room seemed to inhale. His expression had lost its softness. It wasn't anger yet. It was calculation, the look of someone trying to decide how to survive an incoming wave without being pulled under. He called Mara by name, not loudly, but clearly enough that the nearest tables could register a shift. "Mara, come with me." It wasn't an invitation. It was a sentence that repositioned her in the room's hierarchy. Mara followed him toward the back corridor, past the kitchen door where heat spilled out and cooks pretended not to listen. The corridor smelled of soap and damp linen. The manager stopped near the metal shelving where the lighting was harsher, less flattering, as if truth could be forced out by fluorescent bulbs. "Did you handle anything from that section besides plates and glasses?" he asked. Mara's throat tightened. "No," she said. "Only what I served. The wine was brought by the bar, like usual. I didn't open any lock. I didn't touch the presenter after I delivered it." The manager's eyes narrowed slightly, not in disbelief exactly, but in impatience with the inconvenience of her innocence. "That table says the check was settled," he said, voice low. "And one bottle is unaccounted for. You were the point of contact." Point of contact. The phrase made Mara feel like a wire someone could pull. "Then we should check the system," she replied, forcing her voice steady. "Maybe it was rung under the wrong table. Maybe the card was processed and the receipt wasn't placed back. Let me help you track it. We can pull the transaction history." The manager's mouth tightened. "We are not pulling history in the middle of service," he said. "We are not creating a scene." Mara felt frustration flare, not because he wanted discretion, but because discretion was being used as a weapon against clarity. "It's not a scene," she insisted quietly. "It's transparency. If there's a mistake, we fix it. If something is missing, we find where it went. That protects everyone." The manager's gaze hardened. "Transparency is not always protection," he said, and the words carried a tired cruelty, as if he'd said them too many times to too many people. "Sometimes it looks like accusation. Sometimes it looks like you're implying someone important is lying." Mara understood then what she had been slow to accept. In this restaurant, truth was less valuable than containment. The goal wasn't to solve the problem. The goal was to keep the problem from touching the wrong people. When they returned to the service station, the staff's eyes followed Mara in the way they usually avoided doing. Sonia looked at her with worry and something sharper, resentment that had the shape of fear. Luis wouldn't meet her gaze at all. Victor watched from a distance, face composed, but his hands were clenched around a towel as if he were holding himself together. In their expressions, Mara saw the story they were telling themselves. Mara had provoked the boss before. Mara had drawn his attention. Mara had made them vulnerable. Whether or not she had done anything wrong didn't matter. Vulnerability was enough to earn blame. Mara tried to approach Sonia later, to steady the air between them. "I didn't do anything," she said softly when they were briefly alone near the coffee station. "If something's missing, it's not because I took it. I want to fix it." Sonia's eyes flashed with a pain that looked like anger because anger was safer. "Fix it how?" she whispered. "By making them feel accused? By making management feel cornered?" She swallowed hard. "You think the truth is a shield. Here it's a knife." The words cut because they came from someone who wasn't cruel, only exhausted. Mara looked at Sonia's face and saw, behind the fear, the pressure of rent, of custody schedules, of the fragile stability Sonia had built with tips and discipline. Mara's insistence on transparency suddenly looked, to Sonia, like a luxury she couldn't afford. And to Mara, Sonia's willingness to accept silence looked like surrender. Neither interpretation was fully fair, and that unfairness widened the distance between them. As the night continued, small fractures spread through the staff like hairline cracks in glass. People stopped offering Mara small favors they'd done before. An extra refill run, a quick swap of tables, a whispered heads-up about a picky guest. Victor's instructions became shorter, colder, as if he needed to show management he was in control. Mateo watched Mara with a new caution, admiration fading into self-preservation. Luis moved around her as if she were contaminated by attention. Mara tried again to make herself useful, to locate the missing threads without spectacle. She reviewed in her mind every moment at the alcove. The wine delivered, the check presenter placed, the plates cleared. She asked the bar quietly if any transaction had been delayed or any bottle miscounted. But even her quiet questions made people stiffen. The bartender's eyes darted toward the dining room before answering. Voice clipped. "Everything was done the way it's always done," he said, and the tone suggested that anything else was too dangerous to consider. By closing, no one had shouted. No one had been fired. There had been no dramatic confrontation in the dining room. Yet Mara felt as if the restaurant had shifted under her feet. The crisis had not been resolved in a way she could see, but it had left a residue. Suspicion that clung to her uniform, caution that followed her steps. She realized that in a place built on secrecy, her instinct toward clarity could be interpreted as aggression, and her desire to fix things could be read as a threat. When she untied her apron at the end of the shift, her fingers moved slowly, not from fatigue but from the weight of awareness. The restaurant did not simply serve food. It managed narratives, controlled what could be said and what had to remain unspoken. Mara walked out into the night air with the uneasy closure of someone who had tried to do the reasonable thing and learned that reason was not the ruling principle here. She hadn't solved the missing item. What she had discovered instead was more lasting. Trust in this workplace was fragile, and once it cracked, even honest hands could look guilty in the wrong light. The next day, the restaurant felt like a place that had swallowed a secret and was still struggling with the shape of it. The dining room looked unchanged in the daylight-bright prep hours. White linen folded with reverence, glassware aligned in disciplined rows, the faint perfume of citrus polish laid over yesterday's smoke and wine. Yet the staff moved as if the air had thickened. People spoke less. Even laughter sounded rehearsed, a quick release that ended too fast. Mara stepped into her uniform with the quiet dread of someone returning to a room where her name had been used too many times. And she could tell before anyone spoke that the missing bottle and the unpaid check had not simply been handled. They had become a story, and the story needed a villain or a sacrifice. Victor stood at the station chart with his pen hovering, not writing, just holding the posture of control. When he saw Mara, his expression tightened into something formal. It was the same face he used with difficult guests, the one that did not invite closeness. Sonia passed by without meeting Mara's eyes, her hands full of rolled napkins, her shoulders set like a person bracing against wind. Mateo, usually loud, kept his mouth shut and watched her from the edge of his errands as if she were a spark near dry paper. The manager arrived late, face smooth, and called Mara into the corridor with the same practiced calm as before. But this time he didn't lecture. He simply said, "He's here." And the words landed like a door closing. The boss's arrival did not announce itself with noise. It announced itself with adjustments. The host stand straightened. The bar lowered its laughter. A server who had been complaining about a stiff customer stopped mid-sentence, as if the complaint had become a liability. Mara watched the drapes of the alcove shift as the entourage moved behind them, and she understood that the boss had not come only to eat. He had come to restore the equilibrium that the restaurant depended on, the one built from fear, money, and careful silence. Mara was not sent in immediately. That was the first cruelty, being made to wait. She continued serving her section with steady hands, but her mind kept running the same loop. If management believed she caused the tension, if the entourage believed someone stole or lied, then any solution would be less about truth and more about control. She refilled a water glass and noticed her own reflection in the polished silver. Eyes alert, jaw held too tight. She reminded herself that she had done nothing wrong, but innocence had already proven to be a weak defense here. The restaurant did not operate on innocence. It operated on optics. When the manager finally approached her, he didn't look angry. He looked relieved, which frightened her more than anger would have. Relief meant someone else had taken responsibility, or someone powerful had offered a way out that came with a price. "He wants to speak with you," the manager murmured, and his tone carried a strange gratitude, as if the boss's attention were both a problem and a rescue. Mara walked toward the drapes with the measured calm she had learned to use as armor. She could feel eyes on her back from the dining room, co-workers watching with a mixture of resentment and hope, as if her body were being sent to absorb consequences on their behalf. She stepped through the curtain and entered that warmer, darker pocket of air where the rules changed. The boss sat as he always did, relaxed, immaculately dressed, his calm arranged as carefully as the table setting. Around him, his men held their quiet vigilance, watching his face for cues the way other people watched traffic lights. On the table near him sat a small leather folder. Not the restaurant's check presenter, but something heavier, personal. Beside it was a glass of water that had not been touched, condensation forming clean lines down the side like time marking itself. The boss's eyes lifted to Mara with a slow, deliberate interest. Not hunger, not rage. Interest, the way someone studies a detail they plan to use later. "You look tired," he said, and the remark was almost gentle, which made it feel more invasive. He was acknowledging her as a person only to demonstrate that he could. Mara kept her face neutral. "It's been busy," she replied. "How can I help you this evening?" He tilted his head slightly, as if amused by her insistence on the script. "Help," he repeated. Then he gestured toward the leather folder. "There's a misunderstanding in your house. A bottle missing. Payment not recorded. People whispering like children. That makes my time less pleasant." Mara swallowed. "I want to clear it up," she said carefully. "I suggested we check the system." He lifted one hand, palm down, the motion minimal and final. One of his men shifted, not speaking, just reacting. Mara saw again the mechanism of his power. He barely moved, and the room moved for him. "You don't need to check anything," the boss said. "I already solved it." The manager would have called that protection. Mara heard the word in her mind and felt its weight. Protection was never free when it came from someone who benefited from your dependence. "Solved how?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tightening in her chest. The boss leaned back, his gaze holding her. "Costs will be covered," he said. "No one will lose their job over a piece of glass and paper. The restaurant will be safe. Your manager will sleep tonight." Mara could feel the temptation ripple through the air, not only her own but the imagined relief of everyone outside the drapes. A covered cost meant rent paid on time. It meant Sonia's notebook could stay closed. It meant Victor wouldn't have to choose someone to punish to prove control. It meant the staff could exhale. For a moment Mara understood why people surrendered. Peace was addictive when your life had been built around constant calculation. But she also heard the other half of his sentence, the part he hadn't spoken yet. She watched his eyes and saw the calm certainty that nothing was offered without return. "And in exchange?" Mara asked. The boss's mouth curved slightly, not quite a smile. "In exchange, you stop making my presence complicated," he said. "You serve my table when I come." You keep your tone respectful. You don't inspire your coworkers to forget their place. The words were smooth, almost reasonable, and that was what made them ugly. He was offering to remove immediate harm by deepening the structure that caused it. He was buying silence with safety, and he was using Mara as the hinge. Mara felt her heartbeat in her throat. She thought of Sonia's tight face when her phone buzzed, the kind of fear that had nothing to do with violence and everything to do with custody and rent. She thought of Victor saying that leaving cost money. She thought of Matteo admiring power because he didn't yet understand the bill that arrived later. Mara could accept the boss's solution and spare them all another night of tension, but she would be agreeing to become a tool of his comfort. She would be validating the idea that the restaurant belonged to him more than it belonged to the people who worked there. "I can keep my service professional," Mara said slowly, choosing each word like a step on ice. "But I won't be owned. I won't be summoned like property. And I won't agree to anything that puts my coworkers at risk for speaking normally." The entourage's attention sharpened. A man on the far side of the table moved his jaw as if swallowing a reaction. The boss's eyes remained calm, which was worse than anger because it meant he was still in control of himself and therefore in control of the room. "You're negotiating," the boss observed, almost with interest. "I'm setting terms," Mara corrected softly. Her hands were steady at her sides, but inside she felt the strain of trying to reform a system in real time, using only the tools available to her. Calm, clarity, and the refusal to be reduced. "If you want to smooth things over, then let it be smooth. No extra demands. No punishment hidden later. No making me the reason people feel watched." The boss looked at her for a long moment. In that pause, Mara noticed the inconsistency she'd sensed before. He did not lash out, did not raise his voice, did not need theatrics to prove dominance. The cruelty was partly performance, yes, but the restraint was real. He could have turned this into a spectacle, and he didn't. Instead, he measured her, as if deciding whether her steadiness was a threat or an asset. Finally he spoke, voice still low. "You want to protect them," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a label he was placing on her, something he could use. Be careful. Protection creates loyalty. Loyalty creates problems. Mara held his gaze. "Protection creates stability," she replied. "And stability keeps people from making desperate choices." For the first time, a faint crack appeared in the boss's composure. Not emotion, but recognition that she was not speaking in slogans. She was speaking from the ground level of survival, the level his money touched without him ever needing to name it. He tapped the leather folder once with his finger, a soft sound. "Fine," he said at last, and the word was both consent and warning. "The costs are covered. Consider it a gift to your house." Mara did not thank him. She simply nodded because gratitude would have been another kind of chain. She stepped back through the curtain into the brighter dining room and felt the air change immediately. Coworkers reading her face for signs of disaster or relief. She gave them neither. She returned to her section and served her tables with quiet precision, letting her calm be the only message she could safely send. By the end of the shift, the crisis had eased without anyone understanding how. That was the point. The restaurant could breathe again, but the price of that breath sat inside Mara like a stone. She had accepted that the boss could solve problems with money, yet she had refused to let his money rewrite her as property. It was not victory. It was a narrow passage she had managed to walk through without losing herself. As she untied her apron in the locker room, she felt the knot loosen and with it a small, sober closure. She had protected what she could, negotiated what she must, and learned that dignity here wasn't a single stance. It was a daily practice, carried quietly, even when help arrived disguised as ownership. Mara expected the next shift to feel lighter, if only because the missing bottle and the blank payment line had stopped being spoken aloud. The restaurant ran again on its usual illusion. Linen smoothed into quiet perfection, candlelight softening faces into something more forgiving. The scent of citrus polish laid over yesterday's stress like perfume over sweat. Yet the silence that followed a solved problem had a different texture than relief. It was dense, guarded, and careful not to bend the wrong way. When she stepped through the staff entrance, She felt it immediately in the way voices dropped. Not because people were gossiping, but because people were trying not to be overheard by the building itself. The manager greeted her with a smile that didn't quite belong to his eyes. He had that same composed face he wore for guests. Pleasant, controlled, polished enough to look like care. But Mara had begun to recognize the difference between care and maintenance. Care asked what you needed. Maintenance asked what would keep things running. He didn't mention the boss's gift. He didn't mention Mara's negotiation. He didn't mention the fear that had tightened the room the night before. Instead, he handed her the station chart with a faintly cheerful tone and said, "We've got a full book tonight. Let's keep things smooth. Keep things smooth." The phrase landed like a lid being pressed down on boiling water. Mara nodded, took her chart, and felt a small, private anger stir. Not the hot kind that made you reckless, but the cold kind that helped you see clearly. Smoothness, she understood, was not a shared comfort here. It was a product the restaurant sold, and the staff's dignity was part of the cost. Victor moved through the prep like a man maintaining a bridge in a storm. He corrected a table setting, repositioned a fork, checked the wine inventory with a precision that bordered on ritual. In public, he was loyal to management, firm with staff, quick to reinforce house rules. But Mara could see the exhaustion under it in the way his shoulders never fully relaxed, in the way he rubbed the back of his neck when he thought no one was watching. When the manager passed, Victor straightened and became crisp again, as if his body had memorized obedience even when his mind was tired of it. Mara kept her attention on her tables, but she felt the restaurant's hierarchy like pressure on her skin. When she approached the service station, conversations ended. When she stepped away, they resumed in murmurs. It would have been easy to assume they were blaming her, and perhaps some of them were, but Mara began to notice something more complicated. Many of them weren't angry at her so much as terrified of being adjacent to her. Proximity to someone who didn't know how to disappear could make you visible by accident. Sonia was the first to crack the veneer, not with a confession but with a practical truth. In the back corridor, while Mara waited for a tray, Sonia stood beside a shelf of stacked plates and stared at her own hands for a moment as if checking they were still steady. Then she spoke without looking up. "You think he paid because he felt generous?" she murmured. Her voice was flat, not bitter, just worn. "He paid because it keeps the house grateful." Mara's stomach tightened. "It keeps the house stable," she replied, but the words sounded less certain out loud. Sonia finally glanced at her, and in her eyes Mara saw something like pity mixed with frustration. "Stable for who?" Sonia asked quietly. "For us, stable means we keep working. For them, stable means nothing changes." Mara wanted to argue, to say she had negotiated, that she had refused to be owned, that she hadn't bowed. But Sonia's tired gaze made the argument feel childish. Sonia wasn't denying Mara's boundaries. She was pointing to the larger mechanism that swallowed boundaries whole and kept operating. Later, while rolling silverware, Sonia's phone buzzed. She checked it quickly, and Mara saw the flicker of panic that crossed her face before Sonia smoothed it away. Sonia didn't explain, but Mara didn't need her to. The fear lived in the muscle memory. Custody schedules, rent deadlines, school fees, the kind of life where one missed shift rippled outward into a week of damage. The restaurant's complicity wasn't theoretical. It was built into people's survival. The first clear proof that management's priorities were not the staff came in a small meeting held behind the kitchen, near the door where the smell of oil clung to everything. The manager gathered Victor and 2 senior servers, and Mara happened to be passing when she heard her name. She stopped just out of sight, not to eavesdrop for entertainment, but because the sound of her own name in that tone always meant something had been decided without her. "We can't have her making him feel challenged," the manager said, voice low and controlled. "We need him comfortable. He's valuable." Victor replied in a careful tone, as if walking a thin line. "She's not wrong about respect," he said, "but she doesn't understand what's at stake." The manager exhaled, impatience breaking through the polish. "What's at stake is the contract," he said. "What's at stake is the private events. What's at stake is our reputation. You think investors care about staff feelings? They care about clientele. They care about the perception that we can handle high-level guests without drama. Mara felt her throat tighten. Staff feelings. The phrase reduced everything, fear, dignity, rent, safety, into something childish and inconvenient. In that moment, the manager's priorities sharpened into focus with uncomfortable clarity. He wasn't trying to protect people. He was trying to protect the restaurant as an asset, and the staff were interchangeable parts inside it. When the meeting ended, Victor emerged first. His face was composed, but his eyes looked older. He caught sight of Mara and paused, as if he knew she had hurt enough to be wounded. He didn't scold her. He didn't reassure her. He simply said, very quietly, "Be careful where you stand," and walked away. It wasn't advice about physical space. It was advice about loyalty and blame. The restaurant's past compromises began surfacing in the way they always do. Not as dramatic revelations, but as resigned details spoken too late at night when people were too tired to keep guarding the truth. Aaron, moving quickly through the corridor, muttered something about the time they made Anna apologize on her knees. When Mara asked what he meant, he flinched as if he'd said too much and shook his head. "It was years ago," he said. "She spilled wine. They said it was disrespect. Management made her go back out and apologize until he looked satisfied. Then they told her she was lucky to keep her job." Mara pictured it with a sick heaviness. A woman in uniform, humiliated not for the mistake but for the entertainment of power. And then management calling it professionalism, calling it necessary, calling it the cost of doing business. She realized surrender had been normalized here the way poor lighting becomes normal when you've lived with it long enough. People adjusted their eyes instead of fixing the bulb. Matteo, the young busser, offered another angle without meaning to. He leaned near the service station and said, with the eager confidence of youth, "My cousin says if you get close to people like that, you're set. They take care of you." The word "take care" sounded almost tender in his mouth, and Mara felt a chill. She saw how intimidation could be sold as opportunity to people hungry for shortcuts, how fear could be reframed as protection if you were desperate enough to call it that. By the time the boss's entourage passed through the dining room again, Mara's understanding had shifted. The boss was dangerous, yes, his calm control, his ability to make people rearrange themselves without speaking. But he was only one part of the structure. The restaurant benefited from his intimidation. Management used it like a tool to discipline staff, to demand silence, to justify compromises that kept money flowing. Even the guests benefited, in a softer way, by dining in a place where the staff were trained to absorb discomfort without letting it touch the atmosphere. Mara stood at her station with a tray balanced on her palm and felt a quiet, sobering closure settle in her chest. Her resistance could not be aimed only at one man behind a curtain. The real conflict was broader and colder. A system that made fear profitable and called surrender how things work. She could keep challenging the boss's personal disrespect, but that would only skim the surface. If she wanted dignity to mean anything here, she would have to decide whether her resistance was against a person or against the machinery that kept feeding him comfort. And for the first time, she understood that the most difficult opponent was not always the one who frightened people. Sometimes it was the one who smiled while asking them to endure it. The night she saw the boss as a person, it happened in a way that left no room for sentimental interpretation. It was not a confession, not a sudden softness meant to win her over, and certainly not an apology. It was simply a crack in his performance, brief enough that he could have denied it if anyone tried to name it out loud. Mara noticed it because she had spent her whole life reading the difference between what people said and what their bodies admitted in spite of them. The dining room was full in that comfortable, expensive way that made struggle feel like something happening in another city. Candlelight rested on glass like honey, and the air held the familiar mix of butter, charred meat, citrus peel, and perfume. Guests spoke in low tones, confident that their words would be absorbed by linen and music and never turn into consequences. Behind the service station, the staff moved with restrained urgency, still carrying the residue of the restaurant's quiet crisis and the manager's tighter control. Mara felt it in Victor's clipped instructions and in Sonia's careful avoidance of anything that could be interpreted as dissent. Even Matteo, who had once hovered near the drapes like it was a doorway into glamour, moved with less swagger tonight, his eyes darting away when the manager looked his way. Mara had been assigned her usual section, which was management's way of saying they trusted her just enough to keep her useful but not enough to let her be comfortable. She worked steadily, keeping her face neutral and her movements precise. She didn't let herself glance too often toward the alcove, but she could still sense it like a pressure change. When the boss arrived, the room adjusted around him again, as if his presence retuned the restaurant's nervous system. The host's smile tightened, the manager's posture sharpened, and the drapes became a boundary everyone pretended not to notice. When Mara was called to serve the alcove, she didn't hurry. She didn't slow down either. She walked with the same measured pace she used for any table, because she had learned that speed was a kind of surrender. The curtain muffled the dining room behind her, and inside the alcove the light was warmer, the air thicker with cologne and espresso. The boss sat where he always sat, his suit immaculate, his face calm in the way of a man who could afford calm because others were paid to be anxious. His entourage was there, too, their attention arranged around him like furniture that could move. Mara approached with the same professional tone. She confirmed the order, checked the wine, noted the details that prevented mistakes from becoming punishments. The boss watched her with that familiar, quiet interest, as if her steadiness was an object he was testing for weakness. Mara kept her boundaries in the small ways that mattered. She didn't laugh too much, didn't shrink, didn't offer warmth in exchange for safety. She served and stepped back, giving the table space without giving it ownership of her. The moment came when a younger man from the entourage, sharp haircut, watch heavy enough to flash, snapped at Matteo, who had entered to clear an empty plate. The snap wasn't loud, but it carried the same contempt Mara had corrected weeks ago, the kind of contempt that treated a worker like a tool that should not require politeness. Matteo's hands tightened on the plate, and Mara saw the boy's face flicker between pride and humiliation. He had idolized this kind of power, and now he was close enough to taste what it did to people. Before Mara could decide whether to intervene, the boss lifted his hand slightly. The gesture was small, almost lazy. The effect was immediate. The younger man stopped mid-breath, his posture shifting as if he had been reminded of the rules. The boss didn't look at Matteo when he spoke. He looked at his man. "Enough," he said, voice quiet, controlled. No theatrics, no lecture about respect. Just a boundary drawn in the same calm tone he used to order wine. The younger man's eyes dropped, not in shame, but in compliance. Matteo didn't speak, didn't thank anyone, just nodded quickly and backed out with the plate, shoulders tense. Mara watched the exchange with a strange stillness in her chest. The boss had restrained someone weaker than him, not out of kindness but out of preference. His preference for order, for his own atmosphere. It wasn't goodness. It was discipline. Still, it was a kind of restraint she hadn't been sure existed in him. As Mara stepped closer to refill water, she noticed something else that didn't fit the myth the staff carried. The boss's hand, resting near his glass, trembled once, barely visible, like a muscle protesting. He shifted his wrist subtly, as if easing an old injury, and for a second the calm on his face faltered into fatigue. Not sadness, not vulnerability offered for sympathy. Fatigue, the kind that comes from carrying pressure without ever being allowed to admit it. His gaze drifted for a fraction of a moment toward the curtained opening, not toward the dining room, but toward something beyond it, as if his mind had been pulled elsewhere by a thought he couldn't afford to speak. Then the performance returned. His face smoothed, his eyes refocused, and the room was his again. Mara felt her own assumptions rearrange themselves, not into forgiveness, but into accuracy. She had imagined him as pure cruelty, a man who woke up hungry to humiliate. The truth was colder and more human. His cruelty was partly habit, partly strategy, and partly the way everyone around him had learned to translate his moods into obedience before he even needed to ask. His restraint tonight was not redemption. It was evidence that he chose when to be harsh, which made the harshness less excusable, not more. If he could stop his man from snapping at a busser, then he could stop himself as well. He simply didn't when it benefited him. She finished the service with the same calm she had brought in, but her internal posture shifted. Boundaries, she realized, didn't need to be fueled by hatred. Hatred made you reactive, easy to manipulate. Empathy, if she could keep it clean, could make her steadier. Empathy didn't mean compliance. It meant seeing the full shape of what she was dealing with. A man who controlled people, a system that rewarded him, and a room full of workers who paid the price. When she returned to the service station, she found Matteo stacking dishes with unnecessary force. His eyes were bright with anger he didn't know where to put. Mara didn't comfort him with clichés. She simply said, quietly, "You didn't deserve that," and kept moving, because sometimes dignity was offered in the smallest sentences. Later, as the night eased toward closing, Mara caught the boss's gaze once more through the slight opening of the drapes. There was no warmth in it, but there was something like recognition, an acknowledgement that she had seen a detail he hadn't intended to show. She did not look away quickly, and she did not stare. She let the eye contact be what it was. Two people aware of each other's boundaries, negotiating space without raising their voices. When her shift ended, Mara folded her apron and felt the knot in her shoulders loosen slightly. She did not leave believing the boss was misunderstood. She left understanding that the clearest resistance was not always the loudest. It was the kind that stayed calm even when power tried to provoke a reaction. The kind that could hold empathy in one hand and refusal in the other without mixing them up. The night had not changed the restaurant system, but it had changed Mara's approach to it. She would keep her boundaries. She would keep her clarity. And she would stop feeding the myth that cruelty was unstoppable, because she had seen, for one brief moment, that it could be restrained, even by the man who benefited from it most. The backlash did not arrive like a threat. It arrived like a schedule. Mara noticed it when she stepped into the staff entrance and saw Victor's pen moving with an unusual firmness, writing over the station chart as if he were correcting an error that had already been tolerated too long. The restaurant smelled the way it always did before service. Bleach and citrus polish, damp linen, the faint bitterness of coffee brewed too early. Yet the mood felt thinner, stretched tight over something sharp. Sonia was already there, standing near the lockers with her phone in her hand, staring at the screen as if it had delivered a verdict. Her face was calm in the practiced way, but her eyes were not. They looked like someone had pushed her into a corner and then asked her to smile. Mara approached slowly, careful not to startle the fragile balance of the room. "Everything okay?" she asked, keeping her voice light. Sonia didn't answer at first. She slipped her phone into her apron pocket and began tying the strings with hands that moved a little too fast. "They cut my weekend doubles," she said finally, not looking up. "2 of them. Victor says it's because of rotation." The word came out with a quiet bitterness, as if rotation were a polite disguise for punishment. "That's rent," she added, and the last word carried the weight of a child's bedtime, groceries, bus fare, every invisible cost people never mentioned in a dining room full of wine. Mara felt something sink in her chest. She had known consequences would come, but in her mind they had been attached to her body, her shifts, her pride. She had not allowed herself to imagine them landing on someone like Sonia, who had spent years perfecting the art of staying unnoticed. Victor called out assignments in a voice that sounded normal if you didn't know how to listen. No one argued. People didn't argue here. They absorbed. Matteo, usually loud, moved quietly, eyes flicking between the manager's office door and the drapes of the alcove, as if he were trying to predict the next wave. Aaron passed behind Mara and muttered, almost without moving his lips, "Inspection's coming." Then, louder, as if changing the subject for anyone listening, he asked where the extra napkins were stored. Mara followed the thread. "Inspection?" she repeated softly when Aaron returned to the service corridor. Aaron's face stayed angled toward the shelf, but his jaw tightened. "Health, labor, something," he said. "Manager says it's routine. But you don't schedule routine right after someone important felt inconvenienced." He swallowed. "They'll find something. They always do." The idea was practical and cruel in the way systems were cruel. An inspection didn't need to be invented. It only needed to be weaponized. If the restaurant was cited, shifts could be cut. If the staff's paperwork was reviewed, people with fragile immigration status could be pressured. If the restaurant needed someone to blame for non-compliance, it wouldn't be the manager who took the hit. It would be the people who couldn't afford lawyers. Mara looked back toward Sonia, who was now on the floor arranging cutlery with meticulous care, as if perfection could protect her from losing hours. Mara saw the pattern with new clarity. The restaurant's retaliation didn't need to touch Mara directly to teach her a lesson. It could punish the people around her and let guilt do the rest. That was the real leverage, turning one person's resistance into everyone else's risk. During the first rush, Mara worked harder than usual, not out of pride but out of urgency. She refilled water before glasses emptied, cleared plates quickly, moved with a precision that kept her from thinking too much. Yet the dining room kept sending reminders that she couldn't outrun the system. Victor corrected Sonia sharply for a detail that would have been ignored any other night. A coaster placed slightly off-center, a wine glass smudged at the rim. Sonia apologized with her head slightly bowed, her voice soft. The apology wasn't for the guest. It was for the hierarchy. Later, near the kitchen door, the manager pulled Victor aside. Mara couldn't hear the words, but she saw the manager's mouth form the shape of a demand and Victor's shoulders tighten in response. Then Victor turned and walked straight toward Mara, the expression on his face professional in a way that felt like armor. "We need to talk," Victor said low. Mara followed him into the corridor where the light was harsher and the air smelled of soap and old steam. Victor leaned against the wall for half a second, then straightened, as if even resting could be interpreted as weakness. "They're blaming Sonia," he said, and his voice carried a grim restraint. "They're saying the missing bottle situation started because the section wasn't controlled, because staff got too comfortable." Mara felt heat rise in her throat. "Sonia didn't do anything," she said. Victor looked at her with something close to anger, though it was exhausted anger, the kind that had nowhere safe to go. "I know," he replied, "but management needs a name that isn't theirs. And they'd rather it not be yours, because you're the one he keeps requesting." He paused, the words heavy. "If you want to understand how this place works, this is how. The consequences go downhill." Later, near the kitchen door, the manager pulled Victor aside. Mara couldn't hear the words, but she saw the manager's mouth form the shape of a demand and Victor's shoulders tighten in response. Then Victor turned and walked straight toward Mara, the expression on his face professional in a way that felt like armor. "We need to talk," Victor said low. Mara followed him into the corridor where the light was harsher and the air smelled of soap and old steam. Victor leaned against the wall for half a second, then straightened, as if even resting could be interpreted as weakness. "They're blaming Sonia," he said, and his voice carried a grim restraint. "They're saying the missing bottle situation started because the section wasn't controlled, because staff got too comfortable." Mara felt heat rise in her throat. "Sonia didn't do anything," she said. Victor looked at her with something close to anger, though it was exhausted anger, the kind that had nowhere safe to go. "I know," he replied, "but management needs a name that isn't theirs. And they'd rather it not be yours, because you're the one he keeps requesting." He paused, the words heavy. "If you want to understand how this place works, this is how. The consequences go downhill." Mara's mind flashed through the last weeks. Her polite correction, her refusal to be treated as property, her insistence on transparency, her negotiation with the boss. None of it had been violent. None of it had been theatrical. Yet here was the bill and it had Sonia's name on it. Mara stood very still, feeling the sharp discomfort of responsibility. It would have been easy to defend herself by saying she was right, by repeating that respect mattered, by insisting she wasn't the one who created the danger. All true. But truth didn't soften the fact that her actions had become a trigger the system used to punish others. If she denied that, she would be protecting her pride at the expense of people who were already paying in hours and fear. "What do they want?" Mara asked quietly. Victor's eyes flicked toward the dining room, then back. "They want you to stop being a variable," he said. "They want you to reassure him. They want you to tell him everything is fine, and that the staff understands protocol. And if you don't, Victor let the sentence trail off because he didn't need to finish it. The schedule was already finishing it for him. Mara felt the moral crossroads settle into place, heavy and plain. She could accept the restaurant's demands, play the role of smoothing things over, and maybe Sonia's hours would return. Or she could refuse and watch management keep tightening the screws until someone broke. The system was built to make resistance feel selfish. She thought of the boss's earlier offer, covering costs, ensuring safety, calling it a gift to the house. She understood now that his protection was not only about money. It was about control through dependency. If she became the messenger who carried his comfort into the staff's lives, she would be helping the system normalize surrender again. Mara took a slow breath. "I won't let them sacrifice Sonia," she said, more to herself than to Victor. Victor's expression softened by a fraction, like a man hearing someone choose the harder kind of adulthood. "Then do something concrete," he said. "Not loud, not dramatic, concrete." Mara nodded. After service, she found the manager in his office doorway and asked to speak privately. Her tone steady, her posture respectful without being small. She did not accuse. She did not threaten. She simply said, clearly, that Sonia's cut shifts were unjust, that punishing staff to appease patrons was unacceptable, and that if management needed accountability for the recent tensions, they could place it on Mara's section assignments and decisions instead of targeting vulnerable workers. She offered to take fewer premium tables temporarily if it meant Sonia kept her doubles. She made it practical because practicality was the only language management pretended to respect. The manager's smile stayed in place, but his eyes cooled. He told her he would review scheduling needs, the same empty phrase used to bury conversations. Mara didn't press further in that moment, because pressing in the wrong way only gave them an excuse to call her disruptive. But she left the office with a quiet, unglamorous certainty. She had stepped between Sonia and the easiest scapegoat path, and she had done it without pretending she could fix everything at once. Near closing, Mara approached Sonia by the lockers. Sonia looked wary, as if kindness might come with obligation. Mara kept her voice low. "I talked to him," she said. "I told him your hours shouldn't be touched. If they try to pin anything on you, tell me." Sonia's eyes flickered, not gratitude exactly, but something like relief mixed with fear of hoping. "You shouldn't," Sonia murmured. "I should," Mara replied simply. "I didn't start the system, but I'm not going to pretend my choices don't ripple." Sonia held Mara's gaze for a moment, then nodded once, small and tight, as if accepting help hurt but losing it would hurt more. Mara walked out into the night air with no clean victory, only a sober kind of closure. The consequences had landed on the wrong people, and she had finally stopped arguing only about principle. She had begun taking responsibility for impact. The restaurant still glowed behind her, selling smoothness to people who could afford it, but Mara carried a different kind of resolve now. Not stubborn pride, but the steadier courage of someone willing to repair what her resistance had disturbed, even while refusing to become another tool of silence. The shift that followed felt less like a battle and more like an adjustment to a new set of temperatures. Nothing about the restaurant's surface changed. Linen still lay flat and bright. Candles still made every face look gentler than it might in fluorescent light, and the air still carried its careful blend of butter, citrus peel, and expensive perfume. Yet the staff moved as if the room had learned something. The fear was still present, but it no longer sat at the center like an unquestioned king. It had been pushed slightly to the side by a different force, something quieter, made of boundaries that had been spoken out loud and not immediately punished into silence. Mara arrived early and found Sonia already in uniform, rolling cutlery with a steadiness that looked newly deliberate. Sonia did not smile, but she met Mara's eyes for a moment without flinching, and that alone felt like change. Victor stood by the station chart with his usual straight posture, but his expression was less brittle. The manager moved through the dining room with the same practiced calm, though now there was a caution in it, as if he were aware that certain decisions could no longer be made without witnesses inside the staff. Mara understood that her conversation with him had not transformed his priorities. It had merely altered the cost of scapegoating. That kind of change was not romantic, but it was real. The schedule confirmed it. Sonia's weekend doubles had not returned in full, but one was restored, and the second was replaced with a shift that still offered decent tips. It was not generosity. It was compromise, the kind that happens when a system feels the slightest resistance and decides to choose the least disruptive path. Aaron, passing behind the beverage station, murmured that the inspection had been delayed, which in this place meant someone had decided there was no benefit to making the staff bleed that week. Victor did not announce any of this as a victory. He simply ran the floor with a new quiet emphasis on procedure, clearer side work, clearer table assignments, fewer vague instructions that could later be used as traps. The changes were small enough that guests would never notice, but staff did. Small protections were the only kind available here. Mateo, the young busser, seemed unsettled by the shift in the air. He still moved quickly, still tried to look important, but he hovered less near the drapes and more near the dish station, as if he had learned that closeness to power did not equal safety. Once, when he nearly bumped Mara's tray, he caught himself and apologized with a seriousness he hadn't shown before. Mara nodded and kept moving. She didn't lecture him. The restaurant did enough teaching in its own harsh ways. When the boss arrived, it was with the same silent gravity that always preceded him, but the room did not fold as sharply. The host still straightened. The manager still appeared too quickly. Yet the staff's eyes did not dart away in panic as much as they used to. They watched, yes, but with something else now mixed into their attention. The knowledge that at least one line had been drawn and held. Mara felt that knowledge in her own body like a steadier pulse. She was not fearless. She was simply less willing to participate in the old choreography of shrinking. The manager approached her with the familiar careful tone. "He's requested you," he said, as if it were still a compliment and still a threat. Mara nodded once. "I can cover that table," she replied, "as long as my section is supported." She said it in the same voice she'd used to request more water pitchers. No drama, no defiance, just clarity. Victor, standing nearby, didn't contradict her. He nodded subtly, then reassigned a nearby server to watch Mara's tables during the alcove service. It was a small act of support that cost him nothing on paper and meant everything in practice. Inside the alcove, the air was warm and dim, scented with espresso and cologne, and the boss sat in his usual place with his usual stillness. His entourage arranged themselves around him, attentive and quiet. Mara felt the old tension return in her shoulders, but it didn't own her. She approached with the measured professionalism she had refined into a shield, polite, efficient, not ingratiating. She confirmed the order, noted details, and set down water with hands that did not tremble. The boss watched her for a moment, then glanced toward the corridor as if expecting the restaurant's fear to arrive and kneel. When it didn't, his gaze returned to Mara with a faint narrowing, not anger, but assessment. Mara understood him well enough now to recognize that he enjoyed control most when it was automatic. Automatic control was proof that the room belonged to him without effort. Tonight, it required a little more effort, and that irritated him in the quiet way of powerful men. "You're organized," he said, as if naming a trait he could claim. "I'm consistent," Mara replied, keeping her tone neutral. "It helps avoid mistakes." The word mistake still carried weight here, but it no longer felt like a weapon pointed only at her. It felt like a shared awareness of what the restaurant had normalized and what it was, slowly beginning to resist. The boss's eyes held hers for a beat, and Mara did not look away. She didn't stare either. She simply remained present, refusing to offer submission disguised as politeness. A small moment followed that would have looked insignificant to a guest. One of the entourage spoke to Mara with a clipped, dismissive tone, the old habit of snapping without consequence. Before Mara could decide whether to respond, the boss's gaze shifted. Just a glance, controlled and cold, and the man corrected himself immediately, softening his voice, asking again as if he remembered, suddenly, that the room had rules. Mara noted it without satisfaction. It wasn't kindness. It was adjustment. But adjustment was the only visible form of change this kind of man ever offered. The rest of the service passed without spectacle. No raised voices, no humiliations performed for entertainment, no forced apologies demanded in front of anyone. The boss ate, spoke quietly to his men, and left the restaurant the way he had arrived, without fanfare, without gratitude, without needing to announce that he could return whenever he pleased. Yet Mara felt, as the drapes settled back into place behind him, that something had shifted in the restaurant's spine. His power remained, but it had met resistance that didn't collapse. That resistance had not removed him from the world. It had simply forced him to move through one room with slightly more restraint. When service ended, the staff closed down with the same tired efficiency as always, but the air among them was different. Sonia moved near Mara at the lockers and spoke without looking directly at her, as if the words were difficult to carry. "Thanks," she said, quiet and plain. Mara nodded. "I didn't want you paying for my decisions," she replied. Sonia's hands paused on her apron strings. "We all pay for each other here," she said, not accusing, just stating a truth that had always been present. Then she added softer, "But it helps when someone notices." Victor walked by as they spoke, his face composed, and said only, "Good work tonight." It was the kind of phrase he would have used before, but now it held a second meaning. Not just good service, but good restraint, good judgment, good teamwork. It was a small recognition offered carefully, because too much praise could become a liability. Mara left the restaurant and stepped into the night air, feeling the city's colder honesty against her skin. The street outside was the same as it had always been. Cars idling, distant laughter, the uneven glow of streetlights, but she felt steadier walking through it. She hadn't won. The boss still existed. The manager still prioritized contracts and reputation. The system still benefited from fear. But within that reality, a new balance had been negotiated. Clearer boundaries, small protections, and a shared understanding among the staff that dignity was not a single heroic act. It was built the way survival was built, through repeated choices, shared risk, and realistic limits that held quietly, even when the room wanted to forget them.